Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a Zien FS Club ESOP Center webinar, which today is on international share schemes, exporting the vision. My name is Ian Harris. I'm Managing Director of the Zien Group, and I'm going to be chairing the webinar today. We are here in part, at least, through the generosity and forbearance of the ESOP Centre members and the FS Club sponsors. And in front of you right now is the list of ESOP Centre members. We're grateful to all members for their sponsorship of this programme and much else that is done by the ESOP Centre. And the FS Club is a broader grouping of organisations and some individuals who are interested in finance, technology, and innovation in this space. And this is a list of our various sponsors and contributors to the FS Club. And without the generosity of ESOP Centre and FS Club members and sponsors, we wouldn't be able to run a programme of this kind. I'm going to speak, I hope, for less than 5 minutes. And what you're really here for is a keynote presentation by David Craddock, who will speak for 20 or maybe 25 minutes, giving us at least, we hope, 15 minutes for questions and answers. In the matter of questions and answers, you will notice that there is a questions panel in your GoToWebinar box. That is the place for you to leave your questions. Please don't try to email or text me or David with your questions. Delighted though we are always to hear from people, we switch all of those things off and only find those after the webinar. So questions for the webinar, please, in that panel. And we do want your questions and thoughts and comments for discussion. Many people, when we ask for feedback on these things, say they find the question and answer session to be one of the most valuable parts of these sessions, and David is a very willing and interesting responder to questions when he does webinars with us. So today's speaker is David Craddock. He's the founder and director of David Craddock Consultancy Services. He's an independent consultant who has been specialising in employee share ownership and reward management for as long as anyone can remember, possibly he can remember. A little bit longer than that, and he is really ideally placed to talk about the subject for us today. He's the author of the Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Schemes, and as you'll find out today, has been the brains behind a great many international share schemes, which is what we're here to talk about today. So here are the contact details for David, and I will hand you over to David now, and let David explain everything that you want to know about international share schemes, but we're afraid to ask, except you won't be afraid to ask because you will ask questions. David, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ian. Very pleased to be with you again today, and thank you to the ESOP Centre and to the Financial Services Club for their sponsorship. Those of you who attended my webinars previously know that I use the slides to provide copious notes. The reason is I want to give you value. I won't be able to touch on every point which is mentioned in the slides, but what I will do, of course, is pick out the salient features so that you can understand the themes and the principles and the benefits to companies and indeed to governments of introducing an employee share scheme, and in this case, an international employee share scheme. So first of all, let's look at this slide, which is entitled The Challenge of the International Employee Share Scheme. So a little word about the objective. What we're seeking to achieve through the introduction, the implementation of a global employee share scheme is global goal congruence. We're seeking to establish a unity around the goals of the company, the corporate objectives of the business, right across the business, right across all the employee workforces that exist all over the world. So essentially what we're seeking to do is to establish that umbilical cord between the incentive, which is common to all the employees through the employee share scheme, and sometimes indeed through a profit sharing scheme, which might be cash orientated, trying to establish that umbilical cord between the incentive and the objectives. Now, absolutely key to achieving this is what I call the fusion of company culture and country culture. So we have features which we might identify as the features of the company culture. And that will be a branding type arrangement or a branding type implication that the company has about itself. That's the company culture. So we're seeking to establish a compatibility between the company culture and indeed the country culture of the individual overseas subsidiary company countries in which the company operates. And in doing this, we need to respect the national identity of the individual countries overseas. So that's the challenge, really, to establish a fusion between the common company culture across all countries and the fact that every individual country has an individual country culture. Yes, so the culture of Canada is very different from the culture of, let's say, Saudi Arabia or Romania or Germany. So what we're seeking to establish is a way in which we can reconcile and indeed fuse together that very powerful common company culture, the company internal branding, if you like, and the individual identity cultures of all the different countries where the company operates. How do we do that, you might say? Well, this webinar is intended to reveal just how. Thank you for the next slide, Ian. Thank you. So the emergence of the International Employee Share Scheme. Well, the International Share Scheme emerged out of the development of local UK employee share schemes in the 1980s, primarily out of the UK, even though the modern day initiative for employee share schemes comes out of a 1956 initiative in the US by Louis Kelso, the famed lawyer come economist. The International Share Scheme really developed as a UK initiative coming out of the success of employee share schemes in the UK during the early 1980s. The Americans then caught on and followed in tune with the type of initiative that the British resident holding companies were introducing throughout the world. And these 5 bullets just summarize really in a little bit more detail what we're seeking to achieve through the goal congruence objective. So the need is to establish a corporate unity within a worldwide group, okay? And we do this through introducing a unifying employee incentivization. So can you see that principle? That's absolutely key to understanding the International Employee Share Scheme. What we're doing is we're seeking to establish a corporate unity around the totem of the employee incentive, which in turn is linked to the totem of the developing share value. So we're seeking to establish a corporate unity. The basis of that unity is a unifying employee incentive. Through that, we're seeking to excite the entrepreneurial instinct in the employees through involvement in the scheme arrangement within the overseas countries. And we're seeking to do this across many different national and ethnic cultures. That again is this fusion between company culture and individual overseas country culture. And then the totem is the commitment to the common goal and the development of the value, as everyone is committed to that common goal, expresses itself in the developing share value of the company. Now, the reinforcement of this trend is what I just want to say a word about next. I guess really it is fair to say that the development of globalization around the world, of global business generally, has reinforced the concept of the global employee share scheme, although it's not dependent upon globalization. Indeed, when I started to work with companies to develop and to introduce employee share schemes, we're talking about the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Yes, globalization was a concept at that time, but by no means with the profile that it has today. It really was a practical matter that companies wanted to extend their UK and their US employee share schemes into all the countries in which they operated, recognizing the commonsensical belief that we needed to develop a common unity around a common goal based upon a common incentive. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So we've got 6 case studies here which I'll breeze through very, very quickly. All case studies that I ever share are based upon my own involvement in companies over the last 40 years. So let's have a look at case study number one. Case study number one is a very, very recent example that we currently have operative in our business. It's a UK-based high-tech service provider company. And what I've sought to do with each of these case study examples is to identify initially the driver for the development of the company into the overseas parts of the world, quite apart from the employee share scheme. Why do companies seek to establish overseas subsidiaries? And then, of course, it's a natural corollary to say that having established the businesses in the different parts of the world, they want to incentivize the employees who run those businesses in the different parts of the world, all the employees of the overseas companies. So let's have a look at case study number one, high-tech service provider company. So it's to secure a comparative advantage. Those of you who are versed in economics will know the classical economist David Craddock established the principle of comparative advantage. And the comparative advantage here is, of course, in bringing specialist skills into the operation of the company by employing people in overseas countries. So it's specialist skills which happen to be in the indigenous population of those overseas countries. So in that case study number one, the driver for the development of the business into overseas parts, and therefore in tandem the driver for the introduction of the international share scheme into those parts, is employee skills driven. Case study number two, a UK-based advertising company. This is the largest international share scheme I have ever introduced. It was in the mid-90s, late 90s actually, 1998 to 2000, and it was across 45 countries. The Americas, North and South and Central, Europe, Africa, the Far East, down in Australia and New Zealand as well. And the reason why the company had expanded into these parts was to create a coordination for international clients on the basis that, so let's say, for example, the company had as a major client one of the massive car manufacturers that exists in our world, but they marketed across many different countries. So the idea of developing advertising agencies in all these countries was to coordinate the advertising and indeed marketing work, but primarily advertising for that massive car manufacturer, which was selling in all the different parts of the world. And indeed they had many other clients as well. One was household goods, another was high-tech services. So that was a horizontal integration program to develop all those businesses, and therefore it was response to that horizontal integration program that we wanted to incentivize everybody around the world. So it was an international project driven expansion, and that was reflected in the employee share scheme. Case study number three, a UK-based ceramics company. This was across 20 countries, each of those countries having employees, and it was the business had developed overseas to create overseas marketing outlets for products which at the time were manufactured in the mother country. In that company, they've since expanded manufacture into other countries as well. But at the time, the whole of the manufacture was in the UK. So the business has expanded on that basis, and so we needed to go into those marketing outlets and establish employee share scheme arrangements for them. Let's go on to case study number four, which is on the next slide. So this is a UK corporate and personal gifts company. Wonderful company. I first valued this company in 1989 at $1 million. I valued it earlier this year at $500 million. And what this company is seeking to do is to establish a lower opportunity cost of labour for manufacturing overseas in primarily the Far East. So the driver to develop the company overseas is labour cost savings driven, and therefore we go into these overseas countries and establish employee share schemes for them. Interestingly, this company also has marketing outlets in these other countries, just like the previous example. And so again, we involve those people who are running those marketing outlets in the employee share scheme. Next one, case study number 5, is a clothing company based in London. The design and the marketing is of the clothing products is done in North London, but the manufacturing facilities are in Eastern Europe and in the Far East. So the reason for expanding into those countries is manufacturing and production driven, and so we go into those countries and we introduce employee share schemes to bring everybody in line with the corporate objective. And then this last one, which is a really interesting case. This is a company, a Birmingham-based company involved in the manufacture of jewellery. Some of that jewellery is manufactured in the UK, some overseas. But the interesting thing about this company is that it bought a natural resources company in the middle of Africa in order to provide raw materials for its products. And so essentially it was a supply chain and business related investment driven decision to expand into those countries. And so again, the employee share scheme followed suit, and we established overseas share schemes in those countries. Now this next slide, a really powerful slide, the international rollout into the overseas countries. I just want to touch on a few major themes here. The type of employee share scheme, well, it depends really on the design of the scheme. It might be that we introduce a savings-related share option scheme, as we did for the ceramics company and indeed for that advertising company. It might be that we introduce a refined share option scheme which doesn't require savings attached to it, as we did for that high-tech company, and indeed that is a live company now that we're currently rolling out. Case study number 1, in case you want to go back to it. All these slides, of course, will be made available to you through the Financial Services Club website once the webinar is over. So you can go back to these slides and you can study the notes, copious notes, which I've prepared for your benefit. The management of the exchange rate can be tricky, particularly where you're working with savings-related arrangements. The option price or the purchase price is typically set in the currency of the mother country. So it might well be that, and almost certainly will be, that once you get to exercise point, particularly if you're working with savings arrangements, you need to watch it very, very carefully. You might have to make up on the savings because the exchange rate has moved in the direction which causes a deficiency of funds from what you've saved during the term of the arrangement. Alternatively, it might be that the exchange rate has moved in the other direction, in which case there is a payout, as well as, of course, being able to use the money that you've saved to buy the shares. Introduction of phantom savings-related share option schemes. Some countries might pose problems with regard to the complexity of their securities laws. You might still be able to do a scheme with real shares in those countries, but it might be far easier to work with a phantom type arrangement. Might be exchange controls which pose problems to the operation of a real shares related employee share scheme. And so we work with a phantom type arrangement, and that type of arrangement, where you're working with the same related arrangement, the employees will be required to open a bank account, and when it comes to maturity, let's say 3 years hence or 5 years hence, demonstrate through submission of their savings statements that they have saved every month. And then they would receive a payment, which is effectively a deferred bonus arrangement based upon the increase in value from the option price set at the outset of the arrangement to whatever the price is in real terms when they come to exercise the option. I've said a word also here about the employee share trust. Really powerful mechanism where existing shares are recycled using existing shares rather than new issue shares in order to avoid share dilution. Existing shares are recycled into a single employee share trust, typically based in Jersey or Guernsey and the British Channel Islands, to service all countries all around the world in the international worldwide group. So I'm often asked the question, when you're actually working with the employee share trust, does there have to be an employee share trust for each scheme if you've got more than one scheme? No, you'd work with the same employee share trust for multiple schemes. Another question, I'm not wanting to preempt your questions, do come up with all these questions once we get to past. I'm really keen to hear them. But another question might be, do we have to have an employee share trust for every country that we work with? No, you don't. you work with a single employee share trust. We typically base it in Jersey or Guernsey because that's where the administrative strength is, and that's where we're able to secure some further tax advantages, all of which are recognised by the British government. There's nothing sneaky or slimy about that. Well recognised structures which operate in the British Channel Islands, also indeed in the Isle of Man. I have worked, going up many years, with a couple of schemes in the Isle of Man, but notably we work with the British Channel Islands. When it's a private company, that employee share trust will also be used as a market for the shares in the absence of a recognised stock exchange. Factors why governments might want to encourage employee share schemes of an international complexion. Well, the first is, of course, to raise the group's trade and turnover through export-led sales of UK manufactured goods into overseas countries. Yes, that will also contribute to employment levels in the UK as more goods are required by the expanded market, and therefore a contribution to the UK or the mother country, whichever that mother country might be, UK, US, France, wherever it is, their balance of payment surplus. Secondly, to contribute to healthy relations with overseas countries. If you're actually introducing an employee share scheme from the UK into Romania, well, the Romanian government is going to be really keen to see that because it's creating jobs in Romania. Yes, employment creation in the overseas country, reducing inequalities in that country, all of which, of course, trade rather than aid is so highly compatible with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Let's just go back to that slide, Ian, please. Third point is to strengthen supply chain arrangements, yes, thereby reducing the propensity for inflationary pressures by contributing to sufficiency of supply to mother country control over the overseas production and supply, and also to reduce volatility in world markets, where again you've got security of supply, certainty and stability, something that our new government in the UK is so much looking forward to introducing. Let's get to the next page. Okay, export of the home country model. Where we're working with UK and US models, whether it be the UK tax advantage, tax-approved schemes, or the UK qualifying plans, we'll typically try and replicate those overseas. But we've always got to be mindful that every country has its own idiosyncrasies, and so we need to make sure that we're not just doing a stick-on onto those countries, that they've got to be compatible with communication sensitivities in those countries. Okay, last point on this slide is important. Businesses have expanded into overseas countries with a spirit of vision and enthusiasm, I say. Yeah, well, they have. You know, they have a very powerful resolve to establish overseas, and they go into those overseas countries very enthusiastic and make it work. The employee share scheme exportation should be in the same spirit. When we're introducing schemes into overseas countries, we've got to address securities laws, financial services laws and regulations, exchange laws or exchange controls, we might say, employment laws, data protection laws, scheme administration, and indeed communication. Communication is what makes it work. So I've given sort of 4 or 5 minutes left to just talk about communication. Let's go to the next slide. So what we're seeking to do here is to establish as similar scheme as possible around the world for group cohesion and for unity reasons. Although the content of the communication will be different, we need to sensitize the communication to respect the fact that we have different audiences with different predilections, different characteristics, different features. And so what I do is I research the internals of the company. I mean, one of the great wonders of working with international share schemes over the years is I've visited something like 35 different countries in order to do this. These days, of course, it's more through email and Zoom, but in the early days, it was all graphed, you know, traveling around the world, actually meeting companies, understanding the cultures. And indeed, what I learned in those days, I can still graft onto new schemes, which we introduce in the current day, but internally understanding the company, but then working with indices which we can externally superimpose upon those countries. So let's look at what those indices are. Next slide identifies what's the emotional distance between managers and employees. What sort of individualism or sense of individualism or collectivism exists in those countries? Is there a gender implication that there are traditional roles of men and women, or has that traditional type of segregation of duties broken down? What's the risk index of people in that country? And what is their sense of timescale? So do we introduce 3-year plans or 5-year plans? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, immigrant minorities. Always be aware of immigrant minorities when you're actually working with the communication rollout. They need to be treated very sensitively. Often immigrant employees settle better in work when, you know, there might well be turmoil going on in the home. But language and cultural awareness is absolutely crucial. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, Ian, thanks. Yep, linguistic implications. There might be words which are no-nos in a particular country. So, you know, in the US, they have a little bit of a bugbear about the word scheme. They seem to associate it with the mafia, but, you know, we're not talking about the mafia at all. We're talking about a genuine employee share scheme or plan arrangement. That's the plan they use, introduced with the highest levels of integrity. Share and trust, I found, have universal connotations. You need to be sensitive to Japanese populations and Chinese populations, and particularly trying to work with their numbers. 8, of course, is their number for success in China, and there are similar sorts of examples in Japan. Chinese people, of course, are emigrant populations, particularly into all parts of the Far East, but also beyond. Japan, well, they tend to stay in Japan. A homogeneous country, and that has its particular characteristics which you need to take into account. If you're working with agricultural communities, I've worked in Africa with miners, or indeed with farmer communities in Ireland, storytelling is a great way to actually share the message. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Ian. Intelligent levels. Do be aware you've got many different levels of intelligence in the company. It might be good to mix intelligent levels. It might be good to separate them out. You've got to be really careful not to be condescending there. You know, we're not talking about paternalism or condescension in employee share schemes. We're talking about empowerment, and therefore everything must be geared to that principle. But, you know, people have different levels and types of intelligence. It might be somebody's intellectually intelligent, somebody else might be emotionally intelligent, other people might be both, and there are other types of intelligence as well. So respect that. Give them maximum opportunity to ask questions, whether it be through a face-to-face meeting physically in a room, or indeed through a Zoom or a Microsoft Teams, or indeed some people are more inclined to want to share questions through email, or indeed to ring you up. Give them every opportunity to ask these questions. Okay, financial services obligation to ensure that people do have full opportunity to understand the scheme arrangement, particularly if they're shelling out money, like in the savings related scheme. Next slide, please, Ian. This is about collectivism versus individualism. I could do a whole webinar on this, but it's about understanding the psyche of a country. Do we need to emphasize individualism, you know, individual entrepreneur, go for it employee, or do we need to emphasize the collectivism? That would typically be prevalent in the Latin countries. Let's go to the next slide. Gender factor, the masculine and feminine characteristics. You know, to what degree have traditional gender balances broken down or imbalances broken down? How evolved and mature are people in respecting the different characteristics of, you know, so they don't sort of put down women, for example. Okay, next slide, please. Time scale. I'll just give you one example. I introduced a scheme in Hong Kong many years back. This was at the time actually when Hong Kong was preparing to lose its colonial status and become the special administrative region of China. And 5 years to them, even 3 years, was a long time. They wanted to see a result from their share scheme within a year. Okay, final slide, which is a summary position. Win-win for everybody. It's win-win on the microeconomic objectives of the international companies introducing the scheme, and of course for their beneficiary employees. It's macroeconomic objectives for the governments of the mother country in the way that are explained through my very brief economics advantage slide. But similarly macroeconomic objectives for the governments of the overseas countries, particularly where they see employment created in those countries and the reduction of inequalities and the development of prosperity. Remember, if you're developing prosperity together around the world, what a powerful unifier that is. thank you very much for giving me the time, Financial Services Club and the ESOP Centre. Any questions, bring them all on. We're bang on past, Ian, so looking forward to receiving everybody's questions. Thank you.
David, thank you very much indeed for a whistle-stop tour of a very big topic on international share schemes. Unsurprisingly, we have several questions, and I think we'll keep us busy for the next few minutes. In fact, several people have asked a question. I think I know the answer to this question because I think you alluded to it a little bit in your talk, but you didn't cover the whole aspect of this. So I'll encapsulate the question with the phrase: do companies, when they want to put in international share schemes, sometimes pick and choose between the territories within their international operation to be within the share scheme and leave some of those territories out? And what are the implications of making it international but not completely international if a global organization chooses to do it that way?
Well, it's a very good question, and I can answer it in a number of ways. I guess the first thing to say is, you know, we're looking for corporate unity across all countries, so ideally we want to include all countries. Some countries want to introduce it solely for senior management, and it might be that senior management don't exist in every country. But my argument is always to say, don't make senior management isolated in the incentive. So it's always good if you can introduce it for all employees. It really is. It might be you've got difficulties with exchange controls or complex securities laws, in which case you might want to introduce a phantom arrangement, in which case that's a mechanism for ensuring you don't leave companies out. And if you do leave companies out, it can backfire. It can backfire if people feel as though they've been left out. And it's always a good first line of approach to think in terms of introducing it for every country, for every employee.
There's a second related question, which is to do with different tax regimes in different countries. So whether the income tax system is different, whether the way that income is recognized under different jurisdictions. So perhaps what you're doing with in the scheme or plan in one place is completely outside the realms of income tax, but is deemed to be income in another regime. And in fact, Douglas Andrews in particular has come in late, but not too late, encapsulating that part of the question. And I think it would be useful to hear you explore that aspect of you know, the different ways you have to handle different territories.
Okay. Well, I think the first port of call there is to think first and foremost in terms of the design of the scheme. You know, you're looking to establish a design which has a motivation, or very, very strong motivational input, and establishes the share incentive as having an umbilical cord with the corporate objectives of the business. I think that's what I said on the very first slide. So that's the first port of call, emphasising the first instance design, and then look at what are the legal implications, including the tax implications. When I write about tax and ratio employee share schemes, I say this, that tax is often, you know, a tax advantage is often the bait that attracts attention to the schemes. But fundamentally, you should be seeking to establish a design imperative which is linked to the structure. First set of comments I'd want to make, Ian. Secondly, I guess I'd want to say this, that tax will be different in different countries. Okay, now in the UK and the US, we have mirror type of legislation. You know, we have same related share option scheme type arrangements which have similar tax implications. We have EMI and an EMI type equivalent in EMI in the UK and an EMI type equivalent in the US. But when you go into the other countries, the tax can be all over the place. Okay, it might be that tax is deferred. It might be that tax is obliterated altogether. It might be that there are some awkward instances of taxes, and by that I mean, for example, that tax is triggered when you grant an option. Now, we had that problem some years ago when we introduced the scheme into Switzerland, but we were able to structure the scheme arrangement in such a way that we could avoid tax legitimately. Everything we do, of course, is legal, legally watertight. We were able to restructure that scheme in Switzerland to avoid tax at the outset, and that must be a priority, to avoid tax when somebody enters into the scheme. Okay, so that's a sort of flavour of answers to that question. We could talk a lot about that, but I know there are more questions to come. So anybody's got any follow-ups, let me know, and I can always answer by email.
David, thank you very much for that. And there's one other limb to this. So does it work better in certain territories, and you know, can you pick and choose? Which is, and again, I'm encapsulating more than one question into a way that I'm going to try to articulate this question. Are there certain countries or territories where, in your experience, this type of international share scheme rolls out well, and are there some territories or regions where, in your experience, with all the will in the world, it doesn't seem to take so well?
Okay, well, the UK and the US, they certainly senior management and to some degree all employees expect to see some sort of share incentive, and so consequently you get a very good response. The 5 I's, as we call them in international relations, UK, what is that? UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, I think it is, isn't it? The 5 I countries, generally speaking, get a very, very good response. Where there are immigrant populations that originate from the old imperialist instincts, I suppose, going back through their generations, tend to get a very good response, which tend to be those 5 countries again. Germany, you'd think, you know, given the entrepreneurial instinct in Germany and the drive with the work ethic to achieve, and indeed the actual achievement, you get a very high response. My experience is that within the European countries, Germany is typically a country where we struggle to get a great response. I think that's probably because a lot of the big German companies are owned by families, and so there's not such a profile given to employee share scheme type arrangements. Having said that, on occasions we have achieved high results in Germany. Going down into the Latin countries, now this is an example of where it depends how you present it, and this is the individualist against collectivist approach. What I find in the Latin countries, I'm talking here about Spain, Portugal, Italy, if you sort of emphasize the community type arrangements of the employee share scheme, you tend to get a very, very good response. France, I always get a good response. France has a tradition of employee share ownership. It has a tradition of individual, you know, respect for individual rights, and they do have historically they've always had a very, very powerful savings type arrangement, and there's also a qualifying type plan, which has on occasions, depending upon the government in charge, had good profile within the economic life of the nation. African countries, I've introduced schemes in South Africa with miners or whatever, tend to get relatively low responses. High-tech companies, well, here into Wonderworld, you tend to find that with high-tech companies, people involved in any form of tech, that there is an awareness and a wanton desire to be involved in the share scheme arrangement. So that's really tech, regardless of country. I know your question was about country, but I wanted to say something there about, you know, type of business. And where you work with high tech companies, very, very powerful response always.
That's very interesting. One last question before we wrap up. I'm going to attribute this one to Susan Jones. She actually was at least a part contributor to several of the questions, but this question is hers alone. Nobody else asked this particular thing. David, I can see you're already getting nervous for this one. To what extent is the volatile dollar-sterling exchange rate an impediment to the implementation of schemes like this? It's sort of a topical question, and I would sort of broaden it out to a wider question, because there's a presumption in there of course, that we're in our current world where there is that huge volatility, and that the dollar and sterling is going to be an important part of the internationalization of what we're doing. But it would apply actually to whatever currency you were using as the base, and whatever currency was predominant in the territory into which this thing is going, in an environment where the exchange rates are very volatile.
Okay. Well, it's a great question. Multifaceted answer as well. I mean, the first point is the point I made in the presentation, really, that certainly if you're working with savings-related arrangements and there is volatility between date of grant and date of exercise, there will either be a substantial or a comparatively substantial deficiency in funds, or there'll be an excess of funds. If it's an excess of funds, you pay the funds back, and as well as being able to buy the shares. Where you're working with a volatility in the exchange rate, not always, but it can be accompanied by volatility in the stock markets. If you've got volatility in the stock markets, which is probably a separate point, but I'll mention it anyway, a volatility in the share price will produce a higher tax value, well, a higher value for tax purposes of the option in relation to the share-based payment accounting. But volatility in exchange rates, that's very interesting, and particularly in relation to UK and US, where of course there is very, very substantial trade. The main exposure really is on savings related schemes, and you've got to recognise also that when it comes to exchange rates, that they can move very, very slowly. So as well as potentially at times being high volatility, I mean, we've gone down from what 150 since the beginning of the year to 112, I think it was today when I last looked, between dollar and sterling. You can also have times when exchange rates move very slowly. So you can have the opposite effect. If they're moving slowly, then clearly you've got much more stability on your savings related schemes. But the exchange rate, when it comes to the governmental perspective, is very, very important. And what sort of money can be achieved in terms of inflows into a company, and so it can affect the way in which a government might actually perceive the encouragement of international employee share schemes. So that's again a flavour set of answers to the question, but great question.
David, wonderful. Thank you so much for your very thoughtful talk, and also for fielding those well thought through and challenging questions so well. It's only for me now to wrap up today, just to remind everybody that David very kindly provides a full set of slides and materials that are already available for download on the ESOP Centre FS Club website, if people want to go and have a look at them. And I would like just to say a few thank yous before we close down. First of all, thanks again to the members and sponsors of the FS Club, whose generous sponsorship and forbearance allows us to do all manner of interesting things, including the webinar that you've enjoyed today. Also to the members of the ESOP Centre, who likewise are our contributors and through whom these activities are able to happen. I would like to just point you to some resources that are available to you through the ESOP Centre. There's the website and the regular news pad, and on FS Club bulletins, not only on ESOP Centre related topics, but on a myriad of topics. I do commend the FS Club website, and especially the Bulletin Centre, to people who are interested in the sorts of topics that we cover, which are many and varied. There are some forthcoming events, a little lighter than usual over the next week or two, but if you're interested in smarter ledgers, you might enjoy tomorrow's webinar, and the following Wednesday, how to save the world with rigorous carbon accounting, might be for you. And then several more webinars the following week. Is your next lawsuit coming from a river or a forest? The question of artificial intelligence and state of play in the European Union, and also what should be a fascinating webinar on stablecoins. Is this crypto's killer app, or will it end up killing crypto? My goodness, it's like an Agatha Christie here. So all that then remains for me to do is to say thank you to you, the audience, for your time and interest in this topic. And finally, of course, thank you to David for such an interesting talk and such interesting answers to the questions. We can't give you a round of applause in webinar world in the way that we would in the real world. And I had to have a think about what musical instrument should I use, because I do use little musical instruments to emulate the sound of everybody giving a round of applause. And the instrument that popped into my head from an international scheme was an instrument that I think is manifestly international, and there's a variation on it in just about every part of the world, which was the tambourine. And without any prompting at all, when I said to Janie that David's going to be talking about international share schemes, what do you think I should use as my musical instrument? She said, use the tambourine. So we were like-minded on that, which is a relief for me. And this is a little thank you for you. Thank you very much, David. And once again, thanks to the audience. We look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Bye, everybody.